In the face of great adversity, often comes some of history's greatest stories. Throughout history, during the month of February, many brave Christians have stood trial for their beliefs. These heroes of the faith stood for Jesus against some of the world's greatest evils. In fact, history would look very different without these fearless Christians who were willing to risk their health, their reputation, and their lives. It required bravery, fearlessness, and heroism that only few possess. In this month, we recognize the people who stood for Christ on public trial so that we may practice our faith in public and in private places. To some, the idea of standing trial for love may seem romantic. To others, it may sound silly. But because of the hero of our first story, February 14th is worth celebrating. In the middle of the month of February, there's a holiday many people have trouble understanding why we celebrate. While we plan romantic date nights and buy boxes of chocolates or send love notes to that special someone, many people celebrate the tradition of the holiday instead of the man worth celebrating, Saint Valentine. So where do these traditions come from? And how did we end up selling cards and writing love letters because some guy stood trial and died for his beliefs in Rome 2,000 years ago? While there are many historical accounts of who Saint Valentine was, where he came from, one thing is for certain, his impact on this month in history has lasted nearly 2 millennia. On February 14th, 270 AD, he gave his own life for love at the hands of Roman Emperor Claudius Gothicus II on the very first Valentine's Day. Originally a bishop from Terni, Italy, Valentine migrated to Rome, where he was promoted to priesthood during a volatile time in history. Roman persecution of Christians was legendary. At the time Valentine came into adulthood, it was a dangerous time to be a Christian. While persecution had not yet reached its climax under Roman Emperor Diocletian, nor in its diabolical beginnings under Emperor Nero, the Roman Empire still did not embrace Christianity as an acceptable religion. Rome was liberally polytheistic, meaning they worshipped a wide selection of Roman gods. Christianity, though at its time a small persecuted minority, was seen as a threat to the fragile balance of the Roman Empire. Religion and politics were closely intertwined. If you didn't worship and sacrifice to appease the pagan gods, in the minds of the Romans, you were actively sabotaging the authority of the Roman government. They couldn't help but react violently to the Christians' defiance by regularly marginalizing and persecuting all who were found to believe. Common persecution of Christians included the burning of churches and scripture, segregation, and even execution. According to many reports, Roman Emperor Claudius banned marriage to keep single men more independent, more willing to leave and fight for Rome. Gothicus believed that unmarried men made better soldiers. This was important because Rome was in a constant state of war, defending its sovereign reign over its diverse territories during this time. Under the rule of Emperor Claudius the Cruel, Rome was entangled in numerous bloody war campaigns. So the emperor was forced to keep a large, strong army. According to reports, this wasn't easy. Claudius had a difficult time getting soldiers to enlist in the Roman military. Claudius believed that Roman men were unwilling to join the army because of the strong attachment to their wives and families. To solve the problem, Claudius banned all marriages and engagements in Rome. That's when our hero Saint Valentine stepped in. Valentine was said to be a priest that many young lovers went to for marriage counseling. It's true, couples saw Valentine to, according to documents, solve quarrels and give counsel. So Valentine, realizing this no marriage injustice, defied Emperor Claudius and continued to perform marriages for young couples in secret. According to legend, after capturing Valentine, he was turned over and placed under house arrest by a powerful aristocrat and judge named Asterius. Judge Asterius, a reported self-obsessed intellectual, seized this opportunity to challenge Valentine with questions about his faith and the validity of Jesus' claim to being the true Son of God. As not only a priest, but a fiery defender of Christianity, Valentine obliged his captor.
He explained to Asterius the concepts of creation, the necessity for Jesus' sacrifice, and the gift of salvation. Asterius was moved by what he heard, but instead insisted on proof. If the power of the Christian God was real, Valentine should be able to heal his adopted daughter's blindness. So, Valentine placed his hands over the girl's eyes. Closing his own, he prayed a simple but commanding profession of faith for immediate healing of the girl's body. Suddenly, she could see. In that moment, the girl was miraculously healed. Asterius was baffled with amazement. Almost immediately, he and his entire family were joyfully baptized.
Like the news of any miracle performed by Christians in early church history, Valentine's fame grew real quick. When Roman Emperor Gothicus heard that Asterius' entire aristocratic family had converted to Christianity, he was enraged.
According to legend, feeling betrayed by his fellow aristocrat, Gothicus ordered Judge Asterius' entire family to be executed. Claudius also sentenced Valentine to an especially gruesome execution. The priest was to be publicly beaten with clubs and eventually beheaded. Claudius made a point to use Valentine's execution as an example to what could happen to others if they showed the same defiance. According to the emperor's order, the execution was to be carried out immediately. Valentine could do nothing to save the house of Asterius or himself. But one of his final acts before his execution started a tradition that has survived to this very day.
Legend says that before his death sentence, he sent the family a note signed Your Valentine. On exactly February 14th, 270 AD, the order was carried out and Valentine was executed. While Valentine's execution is tied to the date February 14th, it still does not explain how we arrived at today's commercialized remembrance of the saint. That started in the Middle Ages with English poet Geoffrey Chaucer.
The very first Valentine feast day was established a little over 200 years after his execution in 496 under Pope Gelasius. Fast forward nearly 1,000 years, and the most famous English poet of the Middle Ages, Geoffrey Chaucer, finally tied the feast of St. Valentine to romance. In his famous poem, The Parliament of Fowls, he wrote, "For this was on St. Valentine's Day, when every fowl cometh to choose his mate." The popularity of this poem and their romantic metaphorical lines of birds meeting their mates cemented V-Day as a special day for lovers. From that writing forward, the celebration of Valentine's Day grew exponentially. In just a few years' time, by 1415, people began sending their own Valentine notes. They would end them with the saint's famous 4th century phrase, "of your Valentine."
Today, the story of St. Valentine standing up for his beliefs in marriage and love may be buried in a mountain of cheesy greeting cards and candy. But in reality, the story of sacrifice and martyrdom would have directly led to the salvation of Roman Emperor Constantine just 20 years later. For the first time, the leader of the known world, the world that cruelly persecuted Christians, was himself a Christian. This would have led to a massive inpouring of salvations all across the Western world. The ripple effect caused by St. Valentine and his legend is immeasurable. And that is something we're celebrating. Our next saint doesn't have a traditional date or holiday assigned to her, but her impact resonates with women everywhere, and her illegitimate trial is possibly the most famous in all of history. She stood up for her beliefs and, most importantly, proved that women have the ability to lead in a male-dominated society. As a young teenager, Joan of Arc felt called by God to a seemingly impossible mission. end the 100 Years' War between France and England by expelling the English from France and crowning Prince Charles VII as the rightful king. At the age of 13, she was a peasant girl who had never traveled outside of her small town of Domremy, France. She was the daughter of a farmer and didn't have 1 second of military experience. In fact, she couldn't even read or write. But none of that mattered, because she had received a vision from God and nothing would stop her.
In the 15th century, France was being torn apart by a bitter conflict with England known as the 100 Years' War. The two kings, Henry V of England and Charles VI of France, arranged a marriage in attempts at a peaceful transition of power. After the death of Charles VI, King Henry V would be named king of both France and England. This arrangement left the crown prince Charles VII removed from the succession of the French throne. England occupied much of northern France. This area was known as Burgundian territory. Joan's village of Domremy, an isolated patch of northeastern territory, remained loyal to the French crown, despite being surrounded by Burgundian lands. Several English raids occurred during Joan's childhood, and on one occasion, her village was attacked and burned. At the age of 13, in the midst of constant fear of another attack, Joan began to see visions. She claimed to be visited by Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. She believed God was giving her a mission of overwhelming importance. The mission was to one day save France by expelling its English invaders and to install Charles VII as its rightful king. Joan realized that this mission would take her total focus and required the respect of the men she would one day have to lead. As part of this divine mission, Joan took a vow of chastity, and at the age of 16, her father attempted to give her away in an arranged marriage. It was right here that her intellect and ability to sway an audience was on total display when she fought and convinced the local court that she should not be forced into this marriage.
In May of 1428, at 16 years old, Joan's mission began. She made her way to a nearby French stronghold held by those who were loyal to France. She needed to get permission to visit Prince Charles VII and explain her mission. Despite her best efforts, she failed to convince the local magistrate that she had heard from God and was to be the ultimate savior of France. She was rejected and sent back home. However, Joan was set on her mission and was sure of her divine directions. She returned home and rallied a group of people with her passionate words of French victory and returned to the magistrate the following year. The people she brought believed that, according to popular prophecy, she was the virgin who was destined to save France. With Joan's relentless passion and piety, the magistrate finally gave in to the possibility that she could be the one that had been prophesied and agreed to provide her with an escort. In 1429, she took her first step in her miraculous journey. Joan cropped her hair and dressed in men's clothes for the 11-day journey across enemy territory to the Crown Prince Palace in Chinon.
Donning men's armor and accompanied by a small group of soldiers, she reached the castle at Chinon in February of 1429 and was granted an audience with the prince. This is where a miracle occurred. According to legend, Charles hid himself amongst his quarters in an attempt to deceive and possibly vet Joan's supposed divine mission. Joan, not knowing what the prince looked like, miraculously picked him out amongst the others and informed her of her plan. She promised Charles that she would lead the way to see him crowned king, not in secret, but at Reims, the traditional site of French royal coronation. But in order for Joan to accomplish this, she first had to end the siege that was happening at Orleans. She needed control of his entire army. For Charles, taking a chance on Joan, being a teenage farm girl, proved to be a massive risk. Charles had to make sure that she was truly this prophesied savior. So, for the next several weeks, Joan was questioned. In April of 1429, the panel of inquisitors declared her to be of irreproachable life, a good Christian, possessed of the virtues of humility, honesty, and simplicity. Though many of Charles's counselors and generals still advised against such a risky mission, some encouraged him, due to the desperate situation France was in, to use the girl's enthusiasm and charisma to rally the discouraged French army. Charles, whether persuaded by Joan or simply intrigued, granted her request.
Charles gave Joan permission to join the battle, and she set off with an army and new shiny armor to the siege of Orleans in March of 1429. She let her approach be known to the enemy by sending a defiant letter, which they totally ignored. Then, on April 29th, as the French attacked the English troops on the west side of Orleans to distract them, Joan and her men entered without any difficulty through its eastern gate. She brought greatly needed supplies and reinforcements to the besieged fort, and passionately inspired the French to resist. There, she would lead the charge, and the spirits of the French were rallied, and the next wave of battle began.
On May 7th, Joan was struck by an arrow during the battle. However, after quickly dressing her wound, she returned to the fight. This amazed her male comrades. They would later regard it as a miracle of heaven. The very next day, Joan led the army to victory over the English when they retreated from Orleans across the Loire River. Joan of Arc's reputation quickly spread after this miraculous victory. She and her men escorted Prince Charles to Reims, as promised, fighting any towns in the army's territory that resisted. And on July of 1429, they arrived without losing a single man. King Charles VII was crowned as the new King of France.
Joan of Arc had finished part of her mission, crown Charles as king. Next was kicking the English out of France. She believed that the French should take advantage of their momentum and retake Paris, but King Charles was unsure of this plan. However, Joan was able to convince him otherwise. This part of her mission didn't go so well. The English sympathizing Burgundian forces fortified their position in Paris and repelled their attack led by Joan in September. Joan was struck by another arrow and was forced to retreat. A truce with England followed. However, the truce did not last very long.
Joan then traveled to Compiègne the following May to help defend the city against an English and Burgundian siege. There, she was ambushed and captured. When the French troops began to withdraw toward the nearby fortifications of Compiègne, Joan stayed with the rear guard. They were soon surrounded by Burgundian troops, and she was pulled off her horse by an archer. She agreed to surrender and was imprisoned by the Burgundians. After long negotiations and payment, Joan was given over to the English. There, she would stand trial for heresy. The man that would preside over Joan's trial was the Bishop of Beauvais, Pierre Cauchon. He had witnessed Joan successfully crown Charles VII of France at Reims. When he found out that Joan had been captured by the Burgundians, the English sympathizing bishop played a leading role in negotiations of getting her into the hands of the English. He was well paid for his efforts. Cauchon claimed jurisdiction to try her case because Compiègne was in his diocese, though in truth he lacked actual jurisdiction. The English were funding this trial and desperately needed Joan convicted as a heretic. Cauchon was all too eager to please the English in this trial.
Now, this is where her story changes for the worse. On this month in history, February 21st, 1431, the first of 6 public examinations of Joan was held. Joan was put on trial in Rouen, France. Not only did the English want her dead, but the tribunal was composed entirely of Burgundian and pro-English clerics and overseen by English commanders. The odds were massively stacked against her. Now, the English couldn't just kill Joan. They needed her to be convicted of heresy to discredit her mission of crowning Prince Charles as king. If they proved that Joan's entire mission was fraudulent, they could invalidate King Charles' rule. To do this, they would need to prove her vision from God as false.
Bishop Cauchon conducted extensive investigations for over a year while Joan was held in captivity. Joan was ordered to answer to some 70 charges brought against her, including heresy, witchcraft, and dressing in men's clothing. But heresy and witchcraft could not be proven due to her deep knowledge of the Christian faith, as well as her proven celibacy and moral character. The trial records show that Joan was a woman of intellect and faith. When asked if she knew she was in God's grace, she answered, "If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may God so keep me." The question was a trap. Catholic doctrine at the time held that no one could be certain of being in God's grace. If she had answered yes, then she would have been convicted of heresy. If she had answered no, then she would have confessed her own guilt. Instead, she answered in a way that marveled the court. Even a mission into Joan's hometown was unsuccessful in finding condemning rumors about her. Her inquisitors realized no true evidence of heresy or crime could be found against her. So, in frustration, they shifted the focus to the way she had dressed. Joan's decision to wear armor during the battle would be deemed cross-dressing.
During this year-long trial, Charles VII remained silent. To step forward now in defense of Joan, who was being tried as a heretic, would possibly mean that a heretic had crowned him king, therefore making his kingship invalid. So he did nothing, and Joan remained all alone in her defense.
The court considered torture as punishment and even gave Joan a tour of the torture chamber. Shortly afterward, she fell ill. The court decided against torture due to the political risk of her dying in prison before a conviction. The court proceeded to offer Joan of Arc a plea deal. They gave her one final opportunity to repent. However, the English summoned Bishop Cauchon and pressured him to move the trial and sentence forward.
Cauchon pressured Joan to admit guilt. He publicly summoned her to confess her heresy under threat of immediate execution. She agreed and reluctantly signed a confession denying she had received divine guidance and swore, under pain of death, to never again wear men's clothing. Something important to understand is that heresy was only a capital crime for repeat offenses.
Joan relented and signed a confession, one she couldn't even read being illiterate, denying that she had received divine guidance. Several days later, however, she defied orders by again donning men's clothes. Many believe that she had been given the choice of putting on the men's clothing or remaining unclothed in front of her male guards. Fearing sexual assault, Joan once again garnered her protective male uniform, officially breaking her sworn oath. Knowing her fate was sealed, she also defiantly recanted her denial of divine guidance, claiming once again that she had in fact heard from God. Her death sentence was immediately pronounced. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, at the young age of 19, Joan was taken to Rouen marketplace and burned at the stake, her eyes set on a crucifix set before her.
20 years after her death, in 1450, a new trial ordered by King Charles VII cleared Joan of Arc's name. The verdict came as no surprise. The judges declared that Joan's trial was conducted corruptly, deceitfully, and maliciously. Joan's sentence was overturned. The final summary of the case described Joan as a martyr and implicated the late Pierre Cauchon with heresy for convicting an innocent woman in a pursuit of a secular agenda. The court declared her innocent on July 7, 1456. Joan of Arc's fame only increased after her death, as did the passion for the French people against the injustice done to her. When the English burned her at the stake, they not only immortalized the 19-year-old hero, but created a national symbol for the French cause during the rest of the 100 Years' War, ultimately leading to a French victory. Over the centuries, Joan of Arc has inspired countless works of art and literature, including the statue inside the Cathedral of Notre Dame, Paris, paying tribute to her legacy. Her ability to stand trial and not waver in the face of impossible odds has made her into an enduring symbol of French unity and nationalism. In 1920, she was canonized as the patron saint of France by the same church that sentenced her to death. Which brings us to our next story. In the same year Joan of Arc was canonized as patron saint, a man named Martin Niemöller was preparing to make his stand against Hitler. Martin Niemöller was the son of Lutheran pastor Heinrich Niemöller. Like many pastors' kids, he had no plans to follow in his father's footsteps. Instead, in 1910, he joined the Imperial German Navy as a cadet. When World War I broke out in 1914, Niemöller was assigned to a U-boat and was eventually appointed the commander. Under the armistice that ended hostilities in World War I, Niemöller, along with the German naval commanders, were required to turn over their U-boats to England. Niemöller, along with many other commanders, refused to obey this order. As a consequence, he was discharged from the Navy. In 1920, 6 years later, and now out of the Navy, he set a new course for himself. He decided to follow the path of his father into ministry. He began seminary training at the University of Munster. He settled into a normal life of seminary, marriage, and family. But Niemöller couldn't turn a blind eye to what was going on in his own country. He began to sense that the new German government was weak and vulnerable to a communist takeover. But at that time, he was not looking for how the government could solve the massive social problems in Germany, but how the church could.
In 1923, Niemöller began his work in ministry with a job at the Lutheran Home Mission of Westphalia. The organization oversaw the social welfare activities of the evangelical Lutheran church in the area and gave Niemöller an opportunity to more closely understand the plight and needs of the poor. Niemöller believed that more needed to be done to take care of them. In 1931, he resigned from his position there and became the junior pastor of St. Anne's Church. St. Anne's was located in a wealthy parish in Berlin, and Niemöller felt that it was an opportunity to shed more light on the needs of the poor. Niemöller's sermons reflected his strong belief in Christians' responsibility to take care of their neighbor, no matter the social standing. Niemöller felt that there was a damaging social fragmentation and an overemphasis on the individual in German society due to World War I reparations and foreign influence. Niemöller was convinced that Germany needed a strong leader to promote national unity and honor.
When Hitler and the National Socialist Party emerged, the Nazi rhetoric advocated for private worship, the Christian faith, the rebuilding of a broken nation, and nationalist pride. While we now know it was a ploy, at the time, Hitler emphasized the importance of Christianity to German culture and Christianity's role in renewing national moral and ethics. Hitler spoke to things that Niemöller valued, so Niemöller enthusiastically welcomed the Third Reich and voted for the Nazi Party. But when the Nazis started applying racial prejudices to church and universities, like removing Jews from ministry and teaching positions, Niemöller realized the true nature of the Nazi Party.
At the 1933 Sports Palace Rally, the ideology of the German Christians, a pro-Nazi faction within the German Protestant Church, was expressed in the speech by Dr. Reinhold Krauss. At the rally, Nazi racial ideology was touted and embraced by many of the attendees. It was demanded that all Jewish elements be excluded from Christian theology, including the Old Testament. However, for many, this rally was seen as blasphemous and soon led to a radical drop in support for the German Christians. During this time, Niemöller and others had come to realize the dangers of these claims. In response, Niemöller quickly moved to establish the Pastors' Emergency League in September of 1933. This was an attempt to fight against the dangerous takeover of church doctrine and leadership. The PEL strongly opposed the introduction of radicalized criteria for clergy and began to fight against the German Christian agenda. Niemöller and others believed that the changes happening in the church leadership were wrong, and many spoke out against it. On a strictly doctrinal level, they felt that by expelling converted Jews from the church, the German Christians were elevating the so-called science of race above the divine ceremony of baptism.
Niemöller's theological opposition to the German Christians did not affect his political support for Hitler and the Nazis at first. In fact, when Hitler defiantly led Germany out of the League of Nations in October 1933, Niemöller, representing the PEL, sent a telegram of congratulations, emphasizing the patriotism of the PEL members. Niemöller confessed that he later realized that Hitler's anti-Semitism, though much more extreme, reflected a version of his own prejudice at the time. In January of 1934, he was invited to meet with Hitler and two other prominent Protestant bishops to discuss church affairs. At this meeting, Niemöller's eyes were opened to the truth behind the swastika. He realized his phone had been illegally tapped, and that many others of the Pastors' Emergency League were under close watch by the Gestapo. During his meeting with Hitler, the objective was clear: absolute and total allegiance to the Führer and his ideology. Disagreements from the church leaders were not up for discussion. Following the meeting, the other two bishops signed a statement of unconditional loyalty to Hitler, But Niemöller had come to see the Nazi state church as a dictatorship, and one which he fully opposed from that moment forward.
These disputes compelled Niemöller and others to found the Confessing Church, a Protestant church faction in opposition to government-sponsored efforts to unify all Protestant churches into a single pro-Nazi German evangelical church. Niemöller was a leading figure, working to combat the dangerous new doctrine being forced upon and accepted by German congregants and clergy alike. The Confessing Church continued to grow nationally, consisting of now famous activists like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth. Like them, Niemöller soon became widely known throughout Berlin for his criticisms of the Nazi regime. Despite warnings from the police, he continued to preach against Nazi interference with church governance. The Confessing Church saw the Nazi Party's belief system as neo-paganism. As a consequence, Niemöller was arrested repeatedly. In May of 1936, the Confessing Church wrote a public memorandum to Hitler. The memorandum denounced the regime's anti-Semitism, protested its anti-Christian stance, and demanded that it terminate its interference with the Protestant Church. In the eyes of Hitler, it was the last straw. What followed was a whirlwind of backlash, confiscation of all funds, the arrest of several hundred dissenting pastors, and even the execution of several clergy.
Finally, in July 1937, Niemöller was arrested by the Gestapo once again and charged with treasonable statements. For 7.5 months, Niemöller was placed in solitary confinement. Then, in February 1938, this month in history, he stood trial, was convicted, and sentenced. Though he had already served 7 months in prison before his trial, the Gestapo placed Niemöller under protective detention order and incarcerated him in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, once again, in solitary confinement.
During Niemöller's time in the concentration camp, he befriended a Jewish lawyer named Leo Stein. Stein wrote that during their time together, Niemöller did pastoral work among them, even in spite of warnings from Nazi officials. According to Stein's writings, Niemöller gave hope and encouraging words daily. He often quoted the Bible and helped many men through their most desperate hour. Stein says that Niemöller was a friend to Christian, Catholic, and Jew alike, and often tried to protect the Jewish prisoners from harsh treatments, even by risking harsher punishment for himself.
At the end of World War II, after more than 7 years of incarceration, Niemöller was liberated by US troops in Tyrol, Austria. He was sent there after being transported by the SS from the Dachau concentration camp, along with other political prisoners. A few years after his release, he was elected the president of Hesse-Nassau Lutheran Church. He toured the world repenting for the German nation's failure to stand up against Nazi war crimes. Niemöller became a popular figure abroad, widely speaking about his experience in concentration camps and life as a Christian under Nazism. After World War II, he wrote his famous poem, First They Came. It was a public confession of his brief support of the Nazi regime. He was deeply convicted and read it aloud during a service in Frankfurt on January 6, 1946.
First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me.
Martin Niemöller is one of the few people who opposed Hitler face to face and walked away alive. Though he was imprisoned, he never stayed silent about the evils of the Nazi Party. Although he felt that he could have done more, his trial and conviction brought much needed attention to the hate that was being propagated by Hitler's regime. After the war, he worked with several international groups to ensure nothing like the Nazi Party would ever be able to rise again. He became the president of the World Council of Churches and a vigorous advocate for international peace. Niemöller died quietly on March 6, 1984, at the age of 92. Our next story is perhaps one of the most famous to come out of Europe during World War II. A young woman and her family were able to protect and save around 800 Jewish lives during the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands. Cornelia, or Corrie Ten Boom, was born in Amsterdam, Netherlands on April 15, 1892. Her father, Casper Ten Boom, was a watch and jewelry maker. Corrie was the youngest of 4 siblings, Betsy, Willem, and Nolly. As was typical in that day, the Ten Boom home held several family members, including 3 aunts. But eventually, throughout World War II, would famously house many more.
The Ten Boom family lived above Casper's watch shop in what Corrie affectionately called the Billet. As the youngest daughter, Corrie had responsibility for the daily chores of housekeeping. However, Corrie ended up taking the place of her older sister Betsy in the shop when she became ill and had to go to bed rest. Corrie quickly discovered how much she loved the business side of things in the watch shop. She quickly began to see areas where the shop could be improved, including reminders to charge clients for watch repairs and organizing the financial proceedings by developing a systems of billings and ledgers. Even after Betsy recovered from her illness, Corrie's father recognized her business skills and decided to keep her working in the watch shop, overseeing the books and allowing her sister Betsy to take over the housework. Both girls were delighted with this exchange.
Under her father's supervision, Corrie trained to be a watchmaker herself, and in 1922 became the first female in Netherlands to be licensed as a watchmaker. For the next decade, Corrie continued to work in her father's watch shop. During her free time, Corrie established a club for teenage girls. Corrie's passion was ministry, and over the next decade, in addition to working in her father's shop, she oversaw a youth club which provided Bible studies, classes in performing arts, sewing, and crafts. She also worked with special needs children and adults, which became her favorite outreach.
Corrie and her family were Calvinist Christians and very involved in the Dutch Reformed Church. As Calvinists, Corrie's family believed that all people were equal in God's eyes, and the Jews were precious to God as his chosen people. Before World War II, the Ten Boom family had been very involved in fostering Jewish-Christian relations. The Calvinist church the Ten Boom family was involved in protested Nazi discrimination of Jews as an injustice to God's creation. Even Corrie's grandfather had supported efforts to improve Christian-Jewish relations in the 19th century. Her brother Willem, a Dutch Reformed minister, focused strongly on Jewish studies in seminary, studying anti-Semitism and running a nursing home for the elderly with many Jewish residents. During the Holocaust, that nursing home became a refuge for Jews fleeing Germany.
At the beginning of World War II, Corrie and her family began to hear concerning news of the atrocities affecting Jews throughout Europe. Then, in May 1940, when the Germans invaded Netherlands, the rumors of the Nazis' cruelty became real. One of their first restrictions imposed by the Nazis was the banning of gatherings, including youth clubs, just like the one Corrie was running. Soon, word began to spread of Jewish businesses being shut down. Not long after, Jewish individuals being hunted down and taken out of town by train.
In May of 1942, a well-dressed woman came to the Ten Boom's home with a suitcase in hand and told them that she was a Jew. Her husband had been arrested and her sons had gone into hiding. The authorities had been harassing her so much that she was afraid to go back to her home. The woman had gotten word that the Ten Booms had previously helped her Jewish neighbors and asked if they would help her too. Corrie's father immediately invited her to stay with him, even though the police headquarters were only half a block away. Corrie told the woman, "In this household, God's people are always welcome." It wasn't long before Corrie's family became very active in the Dutch underground, hiding Jews and helping members of the resistance.
The Dutch resistance sent an architect to the Ten Boom house to build a secret room for the Jews who were in hiding. The secret room was in Corrie's bedroom behind a false wall and was big enough to hold 6 people. A ventilation system was installed, as well as a buzzer. The buzzer could be heard throughout the house, telling the refugees to hide as quickly as possible. Thus, the Ten Booms created the hiding place.
The Ten Boom house had plenty of room, but wartime shortages meant that food was scarce. All non-Jewish Dutch civilians had received a ration card for obtaining weekly food coupons. Through Corrie's charitable work, she knew many people in the area and remembered a family with a disabled daughter whose father was now in charge of the local food ration cards. Corrie made the risky decision to visit one evening and make her request. When the man asked how many ration cards she needed, Corrie recalled, "I opened my mouth to say 5, but the number that unexpectedly and astonishingly came out was 100. To her shock, he gave them to her, and she was able to provide the cards to every Jew she met, and everyone was able to get food.
But Corrie's involvement in the Dutch resistance started to grow beyond simply gathering stolen ration cards and hiding Jews. Soon she oversaw the network in her area that smuggled Jews to safe places. It's estimated that around 800 Jews were saved by Corrie's efforts. However, the eyes of the Gestapo were everywhere. Corrie was always at risk of being caught. This month in history, on February 28, 1944, a Dutch informant exposed the family's operation to the Nazis. By 12:30 p.m. that day, the Gestapo were at their door and arrested the entire Ten Boom family. The group of Jews and resistance workers hiding in Corrie's room remained undiscovered.
The family was sent to Scheveningen prison after the home was searched and resistance materials and extra ration cards were discovered. Nolly and Willem were released immediately, along with Corrie's nephew. Corrie and her sister Betsy remained in custody. Her father died in prison 10 days after their arrest. Though the house was under constant surveillance after their arrest, several of the police officers were actually members of the resistance group and worked together to coordinate the refugees' escape from the hiding place. Corrie received a letter in prison which read, "All the watches in your cabinet are safe," meaning that the refugees had managed to escape. A few days after the raid, resistance workers transferred them to other locations. Corrie was initially held in solitary confinement, and after 3 months, she was taken to her first hearing.
At her trial, Corrie denied being a part of the resistance and tried to convince the lieutenant that her work was needed. She spoke about her watch business and her work with the mentally disabled. The Nazi lieutenant was not impressed. The Nazis had been killing mentally disabled individuals in accordance with their strict eugenics policies for several years. Impassioned, Corrie told him that in the eyes of God, a mentally disabled person might be more valuable than a watchmaker or even a lieutenant. Corrie and Betsy were found guilty and sent to a political concentration camp for non-Jews, and then to the Ravensbrück concentration camp, a women's labor camp in Germany.
In the concentration camp, they continued to keep hope alive by holding Bible studies in their bunks. After hard days of labor, they held worship services for their prisoners by using a Bible Corrie had miraculously managed to smuggle past the guards. She told the miraculous Bible smuggling story this way.
As we trooped back out through the shower room door, the SS men checked prisoner, front, back, and sides. The woman ahead of me was searched 3 times. Behind me, Betsy was searched. No hand touched me. At the exit door to the building was a second ordeal. A line of women guards examining each prisoner again. I slowed down as I reached them, but the officer in charge shoved me roughly by the shoulder. "Move along, you're holding up the line." And so Betsy and I arrived at Barracks 8 in the small hours of that morning, bringing not only the Bible, but a new knowledge of the power of Him whose story it was.
Each day in the prison was a constant trial of her faith. Would they be bold or fearful in the face of persecution? Anyone caught with a Bible or talking about Jesus faced the consequence of death by cruel punishment. A group of fellow prisoners had asked Corrie to read them Bible stories. Despite Corrie's awareness of the potential consequences, she started teaching.
One day, while Corrie was teaching, someone walked up behind her. One of the prisoners silently mouthed, "Hide your Bible, it's Loney." Loney was one of the cruelest of all the female guards. Corrie, however, felt in that moment she could either stop in fear or keep going in faith, knowing God had directed her to bring a Bible message that morning. So she continued to teach as Loney stood behind her, and as she finished, asked the others to join her in a song. She could see the anxious looks on the prisoners. Now they had to make a choice to be bold, not just Corrie. When the hymn came to an end, Loney told them to sing another one. She had enjoyed it and wanted to hear more. Led by Corrie, the prisoners sang song after song. Afterward, Corrie had a chance to speak to the guard about Jesus and her need for a savior in private. Corrie said later, "I knew every word I said could mean death, yet never before had I felt such peace and joy in my heart as while I was giving the Bible message in the presence of my enemy. God gave me the grace and power I needed." During their time in the concentration camp, Corrie and Betsy led numerous Bible studies, prayed with many of the prisoners, and shared about Jesus. They began to make future plans for after the war and their release. They hoped to build a place of healing, a place where those who had endured the hardships of the Holocaust could be able to find rest, peace, and put their lives back together. Unfortunately, because of the hard labor in the camps, Betsy's health deteriorated, and she died on December 16th, 1944. Just before her death, she encouraged her sister, "There is no pit so deep that God is not deeper still."
12 days after her sister's death, Corrie was released. Later, she found out that her release was based upon a clerical error. It seemed like divine providence, because just a week later, all of the women in her age group were sent to the gas chambers. After the war, Corrie returned to the Netherlands to build the home that she and her sister had dreamed of, a rehabilitation center for those affected by the Holocaust. She began to house concentration camp survivors just like herself. Corrie knew that every word she said about Jesus during her time in captivity could have been her last. I'm sure St. Valentine, Joan of Arc, and Martin Niemöller at times felt the exact same way. They stood for what they believed in and were unwavering in their convictions. Stories of people standing trial for their faith don't just happen in history. They're happening every day. When we hear stories like these of Christians facing intense persecution and martyrdom, it's important to remember what 1 Peter 4:14 says. "Count it a blessing when you suffer for being a Christian. This shows that God's glorious Spirit is with you." Corrie Ten Boom once shared a story of when, as a little girl before the Nazi invasion, she told her father she was afraid that she would never be strong enough to stand trial for Jesus. He answered, "When you take a train trip, when do I give you the money for the ticket? 3 weeks before?" "No," she replied. "You give me the money for the ticket just before I get on the train." And so it is with God's strength, her father said. Our wise Father in heaven knows when you're going to need things too. Today, you may not need the strength, but as soon as you are called upon the honor of facing trial for Jesus, He will supply the strength you need, just in time. It's true, even today, God's strength will always be with us, no matter what trials we face. I hope you've enjoyed looking back at what happened this month in Christian history. What I love about studying the past is that one moment in time can open up loads of incredible history. No matter how much life we've lived, we can all learn so much from the believers that have gone before us. The peaks and valleys that they endured can prepare us to pioneer our own paths. But most of all, they can inspire us to trust in the God who holds all of history in His hands. I'm Cody Crouch. I hope you'll join me next time on This Month in Christian History. Until then, go make some history of your own.